Hello and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Laura Tingle, the club's president. Today's speaker, as they say, needs no introduction. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia. He's written a new essay called The Case for Courage. The blurb says, "Courage is not a feeling, courage is simply a decision to act," which seems appropriate in the current circumstances of Australian politics. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome him to address the Press Club.
Thank you very much, Laura, and greetings one and all. I begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose lands we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. And thank you for the kind invitation to address the National Press Club and to launch this little book I've just written entitled The Case for Courage. It deals with what I describe as the 5 mega challenges facing Australia's future, which I fear have been swept aside in recent years in what passes for our national political and policy debate. This book is one of a number being released this week as part of a new series by Monash University Press called In the National Interest, and I acknowledge Monash for their commitment. When a colleague saw a copy of my book for the first time last week, he quipped, "I could never have written a book like this." And I said, "Why? Because it's not on China?" He said, "No, because it's so short." And you, Kevin, never do short. You always do long, particularly when there's the possibility of writing yet another volume of War and Peace. My feelings were hurt, but I have survived. So I hope you enjoy a lightning read in our increasingly time-challenged world. Friends, I've been back in Australia now for the last year. In fact, the longest time I've spent in our country since I came second in the 2013 national elections. Abbott came first. The reason I've written this book is that for the first time in my life, I now have a genuine, deep anxiety for Australia's future. This is unusual for me. By instinct, I am an optimist. But Australia is now facing the most profound challenges to our domestic and international circumstances since the Second World War. And it is the responsibility of this generation, and what is still my generation, to deal with these nation-breaking challenges as questions of real, measurable, substantive policy. Not superficiality, not as problems in issue management, as has now become our national custom, and not as political performance art, usually second-rate. The time for political posturing, theatre and illusion has well and truly gone, and the time for action has come. Otherwise, we run the risk, by mid-century, of becoming a second-rate country, one that fails to live up to its possibilities and its potentiality, brought about by the corroding of our institutions, an exhausted economic model, and one woefully unprepared for the radical changes now unfolding around us. Today, I want to lay out 3 sets of challenges. First, the slow and steady decay of our critical national institutions. Second, the core economic, climate, equity, population, and national security challenges which will determine whether our future is secure, sustainable, and prosperous, or the reverse. And third, how the national debate we need to have on each of the above continues to be diluted, diverted, and redirected through the sustained impact of the Murdoch media monopoly, as Murdoch continues to control the terms of our national conversation. The integrity of our Parliament. Let me begin with the integrity of our national institutions, starting with the National Parliament itself. And here I must address the elephant in the room. Last year I decided to call this little book The Case for Courage. I meant by that the courage necessary to deal with the deepest policy changes and challenges facing the nation. But what we have seen this year is courage of a much greater order of magnitude as women across our society have come forward to shed light on the predatory sexual behaviour of men. Indeed, we had one such voice at this very podium only last week in our Australian of the Year, Grace Tame. It is wrong that women should have to fear such behaviour in any place, let alone the Parliament, which makes laws to protect all of us. It is wrong that female staff should fear being set upon by more senior male colleagues. It is wrong that young women should fear being sexually harassed or sexually bullied by male members of the Parliament. It is wrong that any woman should fear being sexually harassed, assaulted or raped by ministers of the Cabinet. And it is wrong that women of any age should fear this anywhere. It is not only wrong, it's unlawful. These are hard things to talk about. I know they are hard for women to talk about, particularly hard for women who are survivors. But talk about it we must. And beyond talk, we must act to change this toxic culture. Whatever Mr Morrison and his media minders may wish, it's clear the women of Australia rightfully will not stand idly by while men seek to push this under the carpet and the government encourages us simply to move on. Let me be plain. Sexual harassment and sexual assault in the Parliament are an abuse of power, position and authority by my gender, the male gender, by men. It's not a problem caused by women, or by the clothes they wear, or by how much they've had to drink. It's a problem caused by men. I remember more than a decade ago, then as Prime Minister, stating that the responsibility for ending violence against women in Australia lay with my gender, men. I thought back then that was an unremarkable statement, a simple statement of fact. I was told afterwards that it was the first time a national political leader had said it, and that was before the men's groups around Australia erupted over my supposed crushing blow to their concept of national masculinity. There have been statements from brave young women across politics on this. Liberal, Labor and others. There are many others also brave who have chosen to remain silent. I have great respect for them all. I understand that talking about these matters is deeply disturbing for many women, and I encourage you to speak with the many professional services that thankfully are now available to provide professional help and support. I welcome the fact that they will now be able to tell their stories to the National Sex Discrimination Commissioner. I would encourage the Commissioner to pull no punches in the report she produces and the recommendations she makes. I would also welcome all women who have experienced sexual harassment and assault from whichever political party to come forward and speak with the Commissioner. As for the political fallout for the parties, let the cards fall where they may. Now that I've said this, I'm sure my enemies in the Liberal Party, the Labor Party and the Murdoch Party will be hard at work to find examples of harassment and assault among my staff during the period in which I was Prime Minister. The truth is, with dozens of ministers, with more than 100 members of Parliament and probably 1,000 staff across the country, I cannot in all conscience state that there were no such cases. I simply do not know. What I can say is that across my period in office, I'm not aware of any complaint about my staff, my ministers or my members. And as for News Corporation, and before they resurrect my own drunken visit to a strip club in New York when I was a Member of Parliament, let me note that I was there at the guest of Rupert Murdoch's right-hand man, Col Allen, although I accepted and accept full responsibility for being there. My choice. Perhaps News Corp, which harboured such notorious sexual predators as Roger Ailes, will tell us whether they've used non-disclosure clauses to keep quiet allegations of sexual harassment and assault within their corporation. The Sex Discrimination Commissioner should be resourced to hold further inquiries across, for example, national media organisations and other parts of corporate Australia as necessary, where she considers it appropriate. Let the sunshine in. That's the way we begin to fix this. The uncomfortable truth for all Australian men is this: the game is now up. The age of male sexual entitlement is over. Australian women must be safe in all workplaces, led by the Parliament itself. Failure to do so will leave a stench over the public standing of an institution which remains central to our democracy, the Parliament. Beyond the Parliament, many institutions are critical for the proper functioning of our democracy. Each of them is now under threat. First, the political parties themselves and the corrosive effect of unlimited corporate donations, as evidenced by Palmer's $83 million investment in the 2019 election in support of the Liberal and National parties. Second, in the office of Prime Minister, whose standard approach is now to gag the most basic parliamentary debates, stonewall any tough media question until the press gallery tires and moves on, and the unprecedented scale to which any remotely controversial question put to him in question time is referred to his ministers. John Howard had the guts to answer all the questions put to him. So did I. So did Gillard. No longer the case. Morrison is debasing the high office of Prime Minister in the name of media management. Third, the independent office of the Auditor-General is being starved of funding despite the growing list of corruption, mismanagement and waste scandals. These include the $1.2 billion robo-debt disaster, the $2.5 billion community development grant scheme, the $100 million sports rorts program, the $30 million Leppington Triangle land transfer, the list goes on. With Australia sliding down the Global Corruption Index prepared by Transparency International, the case for a strong federal ICAC is now overwhelming. Fourth, the collapsing independence of the Australian Public Service. My government restored the independence of the APS. We made 0 political appointments to head government departments, restoring the best traditions of Westminster, and we retained all the departmental heads we inherited from the Howard government. All of them. Yet now we have a secretary at PM&C, the head of the public service, who is a long-term Liberal Party operative. The fish always rots from the head. As for the Australian Foreign Service, it becomes a job placement agency for a growing legion of failed Conservative politicians. Australian diplomacy deserves better. Fifth, the collapsing standards whereby retired ministers find loopholes to take lobbying jobs at the earliest opportunity. There is supposed to be an 18-month ban on lobbying by former ministers, but that didn't stop Christopher Pyne being hired by property developers to lobby his state Liberal colleagues, and now his brief exclusion period is over, he's lobbying his former Department of Defence on behalf of a foreign arms manufacturer. And that's before we get to good old Andrew Robb. As Trade Minister, he encouraged state and territory governments to sell their assets to foreign investors. Then, just months after Morrison as Treasurer allowed a Chinese firm to lease the port of Darwin for 99 years, Robb took a job advising that company, not as a lobbyist, but as a consultant. These ministers may not have technically broken the rules, but it hardly inspires confidence. Sixth, the rolling assault on the ABC, its funding and the erosion of its independence. The Coalition has cut $783 million from the ABC. Its real budget is now smaller than it was in 1996. News and current affairs often shoulder the burden, reducing scrutiny on government. Extraordinary political pressure has been applied to individual programs, such as Four Corners, over its coverage of sexual harassment in politics. And Morrison continues to ignore the independent nomination process for the ABC board that was introduced by legislation by my government. Finally, there is the greatest cancer of all on our democratic institutions, the Murdoch media monopoly. Greetings, Boris and the team watching from Sydney. Murdoch controls 70% of Australia's print media, 100% virtually in Queensland, and Murdoch now has the biggest YouTube channel in the country. The biggest YouTube channel in the country. The truth that everybody knows, but very few say publicly, is that Murdoch long ago ceased to serve up credible political news. It's now a systematic protection racket for the Liberal and National parties. And people are frightened of him. That's the truth of it. They're just frightened of him. Murdoch has viciously campaigned for the Liberal Party and against the Labor Party in 19 of the last 19 federal and state elections. That's not a statistical blip. That's what we call a trend. That's what we call a law. Not to mention between elections. They do this through the total conflation of news reporting and opinion. And they do so to advance Murdoch's business and ideological interests, lower tax for the wealthy, minimum regulation, and climate change denial. For Australia, there is a real risk that these 7 factors that I have just run through are slowly driving our democracy into the dust. Each is like a crack in the wall, insignificant at first, almost imperceptible, but then they start to coalesce, and when joined, they start to threaten the whole structure. For those of you who think this is fanciful or limited to Australia alone, I would commend Anne Applebaum's book, The Twilight of Democracy, which explores similar fault lines across the collective West. Australia's daily media diet, dominated by the Murdoch media, also skews the parameters of our national policy conversation, the thrust of the argument contained in this little book. Across the economy, inequality, climate, geopolitics and pandemic management, Murdoch's relentless political and ideological drumbeat diverts our nation's attention from these core policy challenges. Let's look at our need to radically diversify our economy. For more than a decade, Murdoch's analytical frame for the future of the Australian economy has been summarised in 2 words: debt and deficit. Good governments had low debt and deficit, that's the Liberals. Bad governments borrowed, that's Labor. And then along came the COVID reality and a big dose of whoopsie on the part of News Corporation. Now, when I left office in 2013, net debt stood at $184 billion, or 13% of GDP. By 2024, net debt is projected to be 7 times higher, a mind-boggling $1.3 trillion, or 59% of GDP. So what about budget deficits, which is Murdoch's other proclaimed essential measure of government's economic competence? In 2013, at the end of our term, our budget deficit stood at $30 billion, or 1.3% of GDP. This year, 2021, the Morrison government faces an eye-watering deficit of $222 billion, or 11.1% of GDP. Again, 7 times the budget deficit under us. And that's after their 8th budget deficit in a row, having promised back in the 2013 election to get the budget back under control, and insisting, even after coronavirus emerged, that we would be back in black. By the way, because of early, targeted and decisive fiscal intervention, Australia was the only major advanced economy to avoid recession during the global financial crisis. Whereas despite Morrison's spendathon, which came too late, we tumbled straight into recession. But how did the Murdoch media depict our successful approach to fiscal stimulus and its impact on debt, deficit and the economy? You guessed it. Here is just one of their many front pages proclaiming Labor's debt bomb. Really? Exhibit A. And what did the Murdoch boys say about Morrison's monster stimulus on their front page, the one that's 7 times bigger in debt and deficit than ours? You guessed it. Big bucks to bust COVID. with Frydenberg, a ghostbuster acting on behalf of us all. Bad Labor, that is, with a debt and deficit 1/7 of the Liberal Party. Good Liberals, when you have a debt and deficit 7 times that of Labor in government. Exhibit B. I assume the Murdoch media and his coalition partner, the Morrison government, will be formally apologising for a decade of lies to the Australian people on debt and deficit. Perhaps their letter is still in the post. I've missed it so far. The bottom line is that Murdoch and Morrison have lied day after day, year after year, for a decade to get the Liberal Party elected and keep it in power on the strength of the debt and deficit debate. Let us finally inter this debate this day. It has also utterly distorted Australia's national economic debate for the last critical decade. What about the debate, critical for our future economy, on population? As you know, I have long argued for a big Australia of 50 million plus to fund our future national security, health, aged care and retirement income needs. You don't have to agree with me, but we need to have a focused national debate on it and to resolve it, especially now that immigration has collapsed. Where is the debate about our finally and fully joining the global technology revolution? With technology rewriting the rules of economic competition around the world, why aren't we inventing, innovating and commercialising our own breakthroughs at scale in IT and biotechnology and artificial intelligence, using our deep capital markets as established by 3 decades of compulsory superannuation? Why have our rates of R&D, investment and research, commercialisation plummeted when the rest of the OECD is headed north? Our failure to make Australia an essential part of the global technology revolution will turn us into a second-tier economy faster than we think. Where is the debate on the future of Australian manufacturing, where Murdoch joined forces with Morrison's Conservatives in destroying Australia's car manufacturing industry? Did you know we are now ranked stone motherless last in the 36-member OECD in our level of manufacturing self-sufficiency? Stone motherless last. This is just reckless, as the recent COVID crisis has demonstrated. Where is the debate about infrastructure, given the combined Liberal Party, Murdoch Party sabotage of the national broadband network, abandoning fibre optic to the premises in favour of legacy copper, just in time to deliver us in COVID times among the worst internet speeds in the world? And where is the debate about an optimal tax structure for small business, with tax incentives to become medium businesses and ultimately the new big global Australian brands? I don't see any such debate. Instead, we see an attempted tax grab by some in big business, the grafting of JobKeeper payments straight into profits, and forensic tax minimisation schemes by major corporations like News Corp to virtually eliminate their tax obligations to the Australian people. Our big businesses need a reality check. Here we are, an advanced Western economy located in the fastest growing region in the world, which has already become the driver of the 21st century global economy, and only 8% of all ASX top 200 board members have spent 2 years, at least 2 years, working in Asia. Only 1% of these board members actually speak an Asian language. We have become a self-congratulatory, complacent, inward-looking economy whose political and in large parts corporate leadership have been squandering the enormous opportunities with which we are blessed in terms of the potential available to us all. The great global economic transformation now underway, the ownership of new disruptive technologies, the unprecedented wealth generation to which it gives rise, and the engine room of Asia's rise is passing us by. There are other mega policy challenges which I seek to address in this book. They deal with climate change and why we have delayed so long in becoming part of the global renewable energy transformation, and why those opportunities are also passing us by. On equality, why we are not dealing with the growing income gap in our country. Do we wish to go down the path already pioneered by the Americans of a vastly accelerating Gini coefficient, which creates the feeding ground for the radical politics of the far right and, in time, the far left, to destroy the political centre which can drive long-term sustainable reform in any country? I also deal in this book with the challenge of geopolitics. I deal with the great global tipping points which arise as a consequence of China's emergence as the world's second largest economy and, by decade's end, conceivably the world's largest economy. And I challenge the political establishment of this country to develop a coherent, long-term national China strategy to deal with these challenges, not to simply mimic Trumpism, but to develop a strategy for ourselves which effectively balances our national security interests and our long-term economic interests. Instead, we have had a government which, through its rhetorical self-indulgence, driven by domestic political imperatives, has decided that those political interests are best served by rhetorical flourishes against China, which have resulted in China designating Australia as public enemy number one. We may think that's unusual. Can I say it is unusual, given that every other American ally in Asia and Europe has exactly the same conflict and tension between its national security interests and its values on the one hand, and its economic interests with the largest and second largest and potentially the largest economy in the world. But only Australia, of all America's allies, has been singled out for the treatment that we now see. We need a credible, substantive, long-term China strategy. This again looms as a mega challenge for the future. And finally, on pandemics, the fifth of the policy challenges I address in this short book. When we convened the 2020 summit back in 2008, envisaging the challenges which would be washing across our shores by this year, or this year just past, one of the recommendations was that we needed to conduct national pandemic preparedness exercises. You will be surprised to know that later in 2008, we did that. We conducted Australia's first national pandemic preparedness exercise. I even vaguely remember it. I was Prime Minister at the time, amidst everything else. It's my melancholy duty to report to you that that was our last national pandemic preparedness exercise. It was abandoned over the course of the last 7 years. We started from scratch when we saw the outbreak which occurred just on 12 months ago on our own shores. We need to do better than that because other pandemics will come. COVID-19 is not the last. To conclude, in the time which is available to me, what are the common denominators between these five mega challenges and changes that I've outlined in this book, The Case for Courage? First, in each of them, the economy, climate change denial, the assault on incomes, the China challenge, and future pandemic management, Murdoch has acted as Morrison's coalition partner, not as a source of independent scrutiny. Second, as part of this rolling protection racket, Murdoch has aided and abetted Morrison in skewing the national policy debate away from the genuinely big decisions we need to take to secure our nation's future. On the economy, we've had a bogus debate about debt and deficit rather than a real debate about the future drivers of economic growth. On climate, a decade-long fear campaign about lost jobs and businesses from climate change action rather than a real debate on the transition to the new jobs and new industries from a renewable energy future. On incomes, we see, for example, a campaign to kill compulsory superannuation by stealth because of right-wing paranoia over industry funds, instead of a debate about decency in retirement and the fiscal consequences of increasing pressures on the age pension in the decades to come. Not to mention the question of using this great pool of national savings, which Paul Keating delivered to the nation's future, to build the national infrastructure we need for the future. On China, We've had a McCarthyist campaign against anybody who dares challenge the Morrison-Murdoch orthodoxy on China, rather than a debate about how to develop and manage a balanced China strategy that defends our interests and our values, given the challenge of an increasingly powerful and assertive China. And on pandemics, a politically driven campaign focused on Dictator Dan down there in Victoria and the heartless Palaszczuk up there in Queensland, constraining personal freedom rather than developing the policies and mechanisms that will save lives and jobs now and in the future. The pattern in this is as follows. Everything right now seems to be about political management, whether it's these mega challenges that I've just referred to or the avalanche of complaints now being raised by women around our parliament. Looking concerned, with deeply furrowed brow at one level, while backgrounding ferociously against their critics at another, less obvious level. That's the MO for the Morrison government. For Morrison, strip it all back, everything is still about partisan politics, media management, and the science of plausible deniability, all in order to sustain himself in power, rather than an effort to identify the truth of what is unfolding and to take substantive action, either the matters most recently canvassed or on the great policy challenges for the future that I've referred to. And as for Murdoch, well, it's all about power, money and ideology, and screw anybody and anything that gets in the road. And that's why Murdoch and Morrison work so well together. Their interests are complementary. And that is why this nation needs a royal commission into Murdoch's abuse of media monopoly. Together, they have stunted our growth as a nation, our security and our economy. It's time to take them on. Our nation's future depends on it. I thank you.